All right, everyone. So I'm covering something that I've had a few students in my History of the Middle East class ask. This is as of March 2023 when I'm recording this, end of March. And usually when I cover the events in Israel, it's usually about the wars and the battles and the conflicts with the Arab neighbors and so forth. But there are domestic events in Israel that are becoming pretty intense. And I've had students ask me, what's going on in Israel? So I want to kind of talk about that a bit. What you see here is a picture of the current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, flag of Israel, and demonstrations in Israel against something that he's trying to promote in the state, some judicial reforms. So to understand all this, the first thing I want to do is kind of explain a little bit of how a prime minister is elected in Israel, because you kind of have to understand that to understand what's going on. So in Israel, the way it works is you have what we call a Knesset. The Knesset is their parliament. And you have Knesset members, of course, you're going to have elections for them. And you have multiple parties. So, unlike in the United States, when we usually think of two major parties, in Israel, as you can see on this graph, you have one, two, three, four, five, so like nine parties, whatever it is there. And there are actually more parties. These are the parties that got seats in the Knesset. There are 120 seats, and you need 61 to form what is called a coalition. And so, what normally happens when there's an election, whichever party gets the most seats, in this case, you can see there it's the Likud party, which Benjamin Netanyahu is, of course, part of. That party gets to try to create a coalition. And so Bibi Netanyahu has to create a coalition with the other political parties in Israel to be able to govern, right? You need at least 61. Now, what you have with these parties is the Likud party would be what we would consider more of a right center right party, right? Then you have the next one, Yesh Atid, and that's more of a center left party. Then you have all of these other groups, some of which are more left wing, some of which represent the Arab population, some of which represents the really Orthodox religious Jews in Israel as well. And so when Netanyahu made this coalition, he made a coalition because he's more of the right with more of the Orthodox, religious Orthodox parties in Israel, like the Shas party, for example. And so what ends up happening is when you make these coalitions, you also make deals. And Bibi Netanyahu has been working with these parties of more of the right, the religious Orthodox parties, on one issue that they've really wanted for a while, which is judicial reform. What kind of reforms to their judicial system, to their Supreme Court? Well, let's go through some of the reforms themselves. So the reforms that they're talking about, the reforms themselves, if you just first of all look at them that they're being proposed, are actually not so outlandish and crazy and out there. If you just look at this objectively, right? They want to limit the power of the Supreme Court to rule against things that the legislative branch and the executive branches do. One thing, for example, is the Knesset currently, if the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's the decision. And one of the reforms they want to make is if the Supreme Court says something, the Knesset, the parliament, with a majority, 61 votes out of 120, can override a Supreme Court decision. There are some people who argue, well, 61 votes, that's just barely a majority. You may have more support for this if it was two-thirds, but this is one of the changes. Another one is who selects judges, right? Right now, the way Supreme Court judges are selected is this kind of 9-member committee, and one of the changes is to give the Knesset more power on who appoints judges, right? And again, if you think of the United States, how is the Supreme Court nominee picked? The president picks them, but the Senate has to approve them. And it would be more like along that line as opposed to just, a committee deciding it. And some of this is really interesting because before I recorded this, I did some research. I wanted to make sure everything I'm saying is kind of as accurate as can be, of course. And as I was digging in, listening to perspectives on both sides, one of the things I came up with, a lot of the current powers the Supreme Court has in Israel didn't have until 1995. Kind of this a whole idea of judicial review that we think is so common in the United States. The Supreme Court declares laws unconstitutional and so forth. That kind of power, the Supreme Court didn't even have till 1995. So it took a while. So very often as these demonstrations are going on, you'll see rallies in the streets and people are saying, these demonstrations represent the end of democracy. And I think that's a lot of rhetoric, honestly, right? I don't think, and interestingly, you'll talk to people on the other, so you'll see the people demonstrating and saying, oh, we're against these reforms because they're a threat to democracy. And then you'll hear people who are for the reforms are saying, without these reforms, it's a threat to democracy in Israel. And honestly, I think both sides are a bit kind of over the top with that particular rhetoric. And as a side, just the fact that all this is going on in Israel, that there is demonstrations, that you have these discussions and so forth, and you have the freedom of people to express these views, and this does not happen in other Middle Eastern nations. And the fact that this can even happen in Israel is, I think, a healthy sign in some ways. So that's something to think about and keep in mind as well. So if the reforms themselves, if they're objectively not crazy over the top, what's going on? What's really happening? And that's really what I want to try to kind of get to. And I think a lot of it is politics, right? One of the things that recently happened is Bibi Netanyahu is under trial. That's another part of this. He's under trial, and many people believe that the motivations for him to do this are not so much that he really, really cares about, changing the judicial system, but are more about trying to protect his own hide. Now, that could be true. But sometimes both things could be true. It could be true that his motivations may not be as pure as they should be, but at the same time, the reforms themselves might be needed. And as I said, I think definitely the one reform where all you need is 61 votes to overthrow a Supreme Court justice decision. Maybe that should be adjusted. That would make more sense to make it 2/3. But as a whole, they're not, like I said, completely unreasonable. So what else is going on? Well, one of the things that I think is also going on is there's a lot of people who simply do not like Bibi Netanyahu, so it's politics. And the other thing that's going on is generally over the last many years, the Supreme Court is ruling more against the ideas of what the ultra-Orthodox want in Israel. And, there's some things that I think this ultra Orthodox want that are very, controlling in people's lives and, demanding more people follow kosher food and day-to-day living that many people in Israel are more secular. One of the things that I cover in my earlier lectures in the semester when I talk about my history in the Middle East class is Israel has religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, secular Jews, Jewish people who don't eat kosher, and Jewish people have Orthodox Jew with a kosher kitchen, and secular Jews who eat a bacon cheeseburger, right? And they're all living in the same country. But the Orthodox Jews want Israel to be more of a Jewish state in that sense, and there's a lot of pushback on that. And I think that's part of it. There's also a lot of push on what do you do in terms of the international politics. The Orthodox Jews are more the ones who want to create more settlements into areas in the West Bank and Gaza and those regions that other people call Judea and Samaria, depending who you ask. You have different terms for those areas. And there's the more secular Jews who don't want that to happen. So I think a lot of this is politics, honestly. In other words, if things were reversed, if the Supreme Court of Israel generally sided with the Orthodox religious Jews, you may not have the same kind of outrage and so forth of these reforms. But because the Supreme Court generally is siding against them, I think that's where a lot of this comes from. And you think about it in the United States, when the Supreme Court, I think this is a good way to put it, when the Supreme Court of the United States becomes more leaning towards the conservative viewpoint, you get a lot of people who are more of the left who say, oh, we need to reform the Supreme Court, we need to add more justices or whatever, and vice versa. If the Supreme Court goes too much to the left, then you get people on the conservative side say, oh, the Supreme Court has too much power, blah, 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 blah. So I think a lot of it is politics. So what ended up happening is he's calling for these changes, and then there were these mass demonstrations, there were strikes, there was even threats of the reserve not going, the military reserves not coming in, the defense minister, his own defense minister, Bibi Netanyahu's own defense minister, a man named Gallant, he opposed the reforms and he was fired. And when he was fired, that really set people off, and more people were demonstrating and threatening to go on strike. So, as the time I'm recording this, Bibi Netanyahu comes out and he says, well, okay, these reforms are clearly creating a lot of animosity in Israel, and we're going to delay them. He didn't say he's going to stop them, but he's going to delay them. Which brings up a whole other issue, because for him to maintain his coalition and maintain his power, he has to appease the people on the far right of his coalition. And if he doesn't do if he doesn't do these reforms, they could say, we're out of your coalition, the government falls apart, and then you have new elections. So one of the other things you get in Israel is, yes, you have set elections every so many years, but if you have a vote of no confidence, if your coalition breaks, that creates new elections. So you could potentially have elections, every year, right? Whatever it is. And then whichever party can form a coalition gets it. And for a while there in Israel, they had a problem even forming a coalition party. And so it gets kind of tricky with all these multiple party systems. So we have all our crazy in the United States, and we have our electoral college system, which a lot of people don't really understand and completely. Democracy is messy. I think Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except all the others, and it's true. It can be messy, and that's essentially what's going on there in Israel. Hopefully they'll, I always say the last thing Israel needs is to have so much their own civil conflict. And it's not, so far it hasn't been really violent or anything of that nature, but it is problematic when you have a good percentage of the country who are opposed to the reforms. And in talking to people in Israel a lot, I have a lot of relatives there, talking to them, it's interesting. You get, a split. It's very split in Israel in terms of this, right? There's some people who are very much in favor of the reforms. There are other people who are against it. Obviously, the people who are against it are the ones who are demonstrating right now. If the reforms fall through, don't be surprised if you see demonstrations on the other side. But that's at least a little bit of an explanation. There's obviously a lot more detail to this than even what I'm giving you, but I've been asked by several people. Some of my students contact me, hey, can you explain this? At least some details on it. So that's kind of the best way I kind of explain what is actually going on there. And we'll see where it goes, right? Obviously, as the time I'm recording this, everything's a bit on pause, and we'll see what ends up happening. All right, so I hope that's clear. I hope that helps you kind of understand what's happening there. If you have any questions, please let me know. All right, everyone, thank you. Have a good day.